One of the most important things that happens on this side of the pond, so to speak, meaning on the other side of the Atlantic, would have been the colonization of North America and South America and Mexico. The efforts of the Spanish to spread Catholicism, to spread civilization as they saw it, to spread culture as they saw it, by coming over. Folks like Columbus, 1492, right? Columbus sails the ocean blue. But at the same time, we can't easily dismiss that there already was culture, there already existed, civilization. It just didn't look like Europe. So, did the quote-unquote natives need the civilization that the Spanish brought? That's debatable. But for one thing, we know we wouldn't be where we are today in the way that we are where we are in the state that we are in if it were not for colonization of this part of the world. So specifically, we're going to look at the 1500s, 1519 to 1521 to be precise. We're going to look at when the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez came and basically with 600 men and better technology and add a little disease into the mix, was able to come and completely overthrow the vast Aztec empire. He had a lot of lies and violations of trust kind of sewn into his delegation, his affairs with the Aztec empire, and he essentially, whooped them in a very short amount of time. And it's kind of a sad story, really. For one, the Aztecs possessed neither guns nor horses. They didn't really wear clothes much. They didn't have armor, all of which made them appear to be kind of uncivilized and to be completely vulnerable. So, other natives at the time resented the Aztecs due to being raided by the Aztecs to obtain victims for their blood sacrifice. So if you've ever seen Apocalypto, if I may or may not have shown it to the class, depending on which section you're in, but typically I'll show Apocalypto, and they portray the Maya as if they were the Aztecs, which is a total blunder. But the blood sacrifice, the sacrificing, people to the gods, was a common practice among the Aztec. They were pretty much ruthless in that regard and feared by many in the land. The Aztecs believed they were under the influence of a god of war who his name is Huitzilopochtli, and he was this god who was born fully grown by his mother Coitke, the earth goddess, and wielding his weapon, the fire serpent, Xicohtl. He is this god that was thirsty for blood. He was a god of war. The earth goddess, particularly, her name being Coatlicue, and again, I'm doing my best at these names, so they're difficult to say for me, and I don't know the language. These are transliterations into English, so you see variations of how it's spelled and different ideas about how to say it. But I don't know the absolute 100% correct pronunciation of some of these words, but I'm getting close, so give me some slack, right? But the mother goddess, the earth goddess, Coatlicue, had a head composed of two flanged serpents, symbolizing two rivers of blood flowing from her decapitated torso. She wears a necklace of human ears, severed hands, and at the bottom a human skull. Her skirt is actually interwoven serpents, which to the Aztecs would represent childbirth, and blood. That is basically fertility and decapitation. So the god of war, Huitzilopochtli, who was born full grown out of necessity. His mother goddess, Coiltke, was also the mother of the moon, Coyolklaki. And one day, while she was sweeping her temple on top of Coatepec Hill, symbolically represented in the Tenochtitlan by the Temple Mayor, she had been miraculously impregnated with the god of war, Huitzilopochtli, by a ball of feathers that floated down from the sky. So anything can happen, apparently, right? So watch out for those feathers. But Coyolklaki viewed her mother's pregnancy as an offense to the modesty that she so decided that she wanted to kill her mother. This doesn't sit well with Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, so he decides to kill his moon sister. And in case you didn't know at this point, I'm actually telling you the myth behind them. So this didn't really happen. I mean, this is a myth, a story about the gods. It's going to explain something that happens in the natural. So decapitating his sister, as she tumbles down the hill, she became further dismembered. So this explains the moon phases, and it's waning each month as it disappears. So some things to note here that are interesting in terms of the feminine goddess and like the association with a moon. The reason that we find throughout the history of myth this close association between women, goddesses, and the moon is partly because of the association with the menses cycle of women and the moon cycles. So the mother goddess is usually associated with the earth because the earth is the source of life. And then we have this supernatural birth of her son, which is notably interesting. The women associated with the serpent and the severed limbs is also something we can see throughout other mythological stories. Eve in the Garden of Eden. This is a little different, of course, but then throughout this story, you have Eve, and she has an encounter with a serpent. Kali is a Hindu goddess, and she wears a skirt of severed limbs. Medusa has a head of snakes, I guess, serpent hair. The goddesses and priestesses at Gnosis, if you remember way back early on in the text, that they weren't sure if these were goddesses or priestesses, but they're holding snakes, and so that's a common association. But anyway, so a giant disc over 10 feet across was found at the base of the Templo Mayor, and it depicts the moon goddess decapitated, arms and legs dismembered. She also has had two heads, a two-headed serpent belt bearing a skull, like the necklace her mother wears. Huitzilopochtli ordered the Aztec priest to search for cactus with a great eagle perched on it, and there established a city in his name. So actually, if you look at the Mexican flag, it is the cactus with the eagle perched on it, right? And then the overcoming the serpent. So this is how the story behind how Mexico City is established. So as they wandered, they find this place that they know that their god of war had told them to go to, and they find it, and it's a lake, And there is in the center of the lake an island, which is where they build their city. And so they found the place on the shores of Lake Texcoco. The cactus bears this red fruit in the shape of the hearts that Huitzilopochtli devoured, and the eagle was the symbol of the god himself. The Aztecs proceeded to build the great city of Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. The design in the center of the Mexican flag, like I was telling you, is derived from the Aztec legend of Tenochtitlan, Cactus Rock. According to the legend, the Aztecs couldn't settle until they located a cactus on a plant on an island in a lake. So they wandered until they find it, and then they settled down. The sacred spot would also have an eagle holding a snake in its beak. If you don't remember, if you look at the Mexican flag, you can see that imagery. The wandering Aztecs found this place in 1325, and they built their empire, which was, later conquered by Cortez in 1521. The green, white, and red of the Mexican flag date back to a national emblem that was created at the Iguala Convention of 1821. The vertical tricolor was introduced in November that same year, representing independence for green, religion for white, unity for red. It included a crown above the eagle and a cactus symbol because for the first year of independence, Mexico was an empire, not a republic. The present form of the flag was made official in 1968, September 17th to be exact. So evidence, though, suggests that just before Cortez's arrival in about 1450, the Aztecs wiped out the entire population of Casas Grandes for sacrifices near present-day Chihuahua in northern Mexico. Now, one of the most important documents of the Spanish conquest was the 1581 document called History of the Indies in New Spain. Duran was a Dominican priest who was fluent in Nahuatl. The history was that it is the product of interviews and conversations with the Aztecs. This history was compiled, and it represents an effort to preserve Aztec culture, recounting Aztec history from its creation story through the Spanish conquest. In this particular document, one illustration shows one of Cortez's generals, Pedro de Alvarado, confronting the Aztec army orders of the eagle and the jaguar. The Spanish have armor and crossbows and firearms. The Aztecs have spears. Now, who do you think won? Let's see. Though technologically advanced, they were still in a bit of trouble. Alvarado was besieged by Aztecs, angry at the slaughter of hundreds of Aztecs during the fiesta of Tocatl, staged to impress some of their Spanish visitors. So there is another important book, text, called the Florentine Codex, which was from Father Bernardino de Sahagún. And in the Florentine Codex, Book 12, Chapter 20, we have what we know about the Mexica. Here it is told how the Spaniards they murdered the Mexicans who were celebrating the fiesta of Huitzilopochtli in the place they called the Patio of the Gods. Now, at this time, when everyone was enjoying the fiesta, when everyone was already dancing, when everyone was already singing, when song was linked to song and songs roared like the waves, it is in that precise moment the Spaniards determined to come and kill the people. They came into the patio armed for battle. They came close to the exits, the steps, and the entrances to the patio. The gate of the eagle in the smallest palace, the gate of the Conestock, and the gate of the Snake of Mirrors, and when they had closed them, no one could get out anywhere. So once they had this done, they entered the sacred patio to kill the people. They came on foot, carrying swords and wooden and metal shields. Immediately they surrounded all those celebrating and dancing, and they rushed into the place where the drums were played, attacked the man who was drumming, and cut off both his arms, cut off his head with such force that allegedly it flew off, falling far away. So at that moment, they then attacked all the people, stabbing them, spearing them, wounding them with their swords. They struck some from behind, who fell instantly to the ground with their entrails hanging out of their bodies. They cut off the heads of some and smashed the heads of others into little pieces. They struck some in the shoulders and tore their arms from their bodies. They struck some in the thighs and some in the calves. They slashed others in the abdomen, and their entrails fell to the earth. There were some who even tried to run away, but their bowels spilled out as they ran. These details are found in that codex, very, very gruesome details. They seem to get their feet entangled with their own entrails, it says, eager to flee, but nowhere to run. Some tried to escape, but the Spaniards murdered them at the gates while they laughed. Others climbed the walls, but they could not save themselves. Others entered the communal house where they were safe for a while. Others lay down among the victims and pretended to be dead. But if they stood up again, the Spaniards would see them and kill them. So the blood of the warriors ran like water as they ran, forming pools which widened as the smell of blood and entrails fouled the air. And the Spaniards walked everywhere, searching the communal houses to kill those who were hiding. They ran everywhere. They searched every place. When people outside the sacred patio learned of the massacre, shouting began. Captains, Mexicas, come here quickly. Come here with all arms, spears, and shields. Our captains have been murdered. Our warriors have been slain. O Mexica, captains, our warriors have been annihilated. Quote, unquote. The roar was heard, the screams, the people wailed as they beat their palms against their lips. Quickly the captains assembled as if planned in advance and carried their spears and shields. Then the battle really began. The Mexicas attacked them, the Spanish, with arrows and javelins, including small javelins used for hunting birds. They furiously hurled their javelins at the Spaniards. It was as if a layer of yellow canes spread over the Spaniards. So throughout these events, the Aztec king, Montezuma, formerly spelled Montezuma, had remained a prisoner of the Spanish forces. Cortez had promised to be friends with Montezuma, but once he was admitted into Tenochtitlan, he imprisoned Montezuma. Cortez had learned of an Aztec myth concerning Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, remember, who was widely worshipped throughout Mexico. Now, in this myth, Cortez uses this to his advantage, but in the myth, Quetzalcoatl was dethroned by his evil brother Tezcatlipoca, the god of war, and fled to the Gulf of Mexico, where he burst into flames and ascended into the heavens, becoming the morning star Venus. Now, in another version, he sailed across the sea on a raft of serpents, promising to one day return. It was said that Quetzalcoatl was fair-skinned and bearded, which worked to Cortez's advantage because so was Cortez. Montezuma believed that Cortez was the returning Quetzalcoatl and coming back, he welcomes him without any resistance. Within 2 years, Cortez's army had crushed Montezuma's people in the name of Spain. Of the 20 to 25 million inhabitants of Mexico at that time, only about 2 million survived. They remained, the ones that remained were, kind of overtaken by the Spanish. And those who weren't killed in the 2 million, many of which were destroyed by war and disease as well. Their beautiful capital, Tenochtitlan, surrounded by the waters of Lake Texcoco, would be transformed into the capital of New Spain. But how did Cortez get a leg up? This is often a topic of discussion amongst scholars. But one thing we know for sure is that Cortez didn't speak the language of the Aztec. He would have needed a translator. So during the conquest of Mexico, Spanish and Nahuatl, the mother tongue of the people, there had to be some sort of communication between the Spanish and the Nahuatl. So these mother tongues of the conquistadors in the Mexica grew newly powerful. Maya, Otomi, and hundreds of other languages were spoken in Mesoamerica in the early 16th century. But what gets really accentuated and highlighted is this Nahuatl. So Hernan Cortez understood only Spanish, though. So whenever he met with indigenous allies or confronted enemies, whenever he solicited food for his men or sought directions across mountainous terrain, he relied upon perilous and delicate acts of translation. In the early days, Spanish was translated to Maya, then to Nahuatl. Later it would be Nahuatl to Spanish, or the reverse. From 1519 to 1526, Cortez trusted in the translations and counsel of a woman, and she traveled across Mexico by his side. Her name was Doña Marina in Spanish and Malintzin in Nahuatl. Today, she is often called Malinche. There's a sort of associated idea that if you are a Malinche, you are a traitor. That you basically, because as you look at history, there's this idea that she kind of sells out her people because she sides, with Cortez and does his translation, which essentially leads to the fall of the Aztec people. But it's also what gives birth to what we would call the Mexican, what we would call the combination of the native and the Spanish, producing a new, race, a new people, right? Anyway, these are vastly and hotly debated topics, so I don't want to get too much into any of that. But let's talk a little bit about her. She's got an interesting story. Doña Marina, in 1519, shortly after Cortez arrives on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, this young woman was one of 20 slaves that were offered to the Spanish conquistadors. She was baptized Marina. She distinguished herself in extraordinary ways, becoming instrumental to the Spaniards' logistical ambitions and political endeavors. She served as translator, negotiator, and cultural mediator. She was also Cortez's concubine and gave birth to their son, Martin. In 1524, she was married to the conquistador Juan de Jaramillo, but she again becomes a mother, this time to a daughter called Maria. The daily patterns of Doña Marina's life cannot really be very well documented, but she may have received some formal education as a child, but she also suffered abandonment and slavery. And for all the respect and title of Doña and the prefix, suffix in Nahuatl to be Tzin in Malintzin imply that she endured difficult days. She survived the massacre of indigenous people at Cholula, the conquest of Tenochtitlan, a grueling march with Cortez and his men to Honduras and back. She witnessed the deaths of hundreds and bore the children of 2 Spanish men. Whatever her ability to negotiate cultural differences, she died a young woman in or before 1527 and probably not more than 25 years old. 16th century sources on Doña Marina and Malintzin tell us some things as well. As with so many women from the past, none of Doña Marina's actual words have survived, although descriptions written by conquistadors who knew and relied upon her stress her linguistic abilities. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who marched with Cortez, claims she was beautiful and intelligent. She could speak Nahuatl and Maya. Without her, he says, the Spaniards could not have understood the language of Mexico. Diaz's account is probably the most generous of any conquistador, but it was written decades after the conquest. His eyewitness history filtered through memory. The reliability of the source is debatable. In contrast, the conquistador who knew this woman best, which would be Hernán Cortez, mentions Doña Marina just twice in his letters to the King of Spain. Her appearance in the second letter has become the most famous. Here he describes her not by name, but as la lengua que es una india desta tierra, the tongue, the translator, who is an Indian woman of this land. Indigenous sources from the 16th century depict Malintzin through her deeds. The Florentine Codex, one of the most extensive Nahuatl descriptions of the conquest, hints at Malintzin's bravery, as when she speaks from a palace rooftop ordering food brought to the Spaniards, or at other times gold. In visual images, Malintzin appears as a well-dressed young woman, often standing between men who communicate and negotiate via her multilingual skills. Scenes from the Lienzo de Tlaxcala now have fragments from a larger set of images drawn upon pre-conquest painting techniques and conventions. Like Malintzin herself, the lienzo straddles the world of indigenous, pre-conquest practice and European intervention. Indigenous paintings of Malintzin from the 16th century do not bear their maker's signature, and in many post-date her death, so again, we don't know much about them. Whether she would have approved of any of these images, we cannot say, because so few women surface in the indigenous representations of the conquest. She had repeated appearances, so this confirms that Nahuas and not only Spaniards recognized her importance. Some recent sources since the 16th century on Malinche, Doña Marina, or who we would also call Malintzin. Doña Marina's reputation has remained really neither static nor settled. Some have condemned her as a traitor and collaborator because she aided the Spaniards, quickening the demise of indigenous Mexico and the rise of foreign rule. But for others, she is the consummate strategist. I mean, she passed to Cortez as a slave, forced to travel at his side. What were her options for survival if she did not translate? If she would not bear his child? It's a matter of survival. It's hard to say that anyone wouldn't do the same thing if put in the same circumstance. So how could we blame someone who had no rights, who was, sold into slavery, abandoned, forced to find a way to survive, and if it had to be by pleasing who was seen as the enemy in order to survive, maybe even to protect the life of her children, people, it'd be hard for us to blame her, in my opinion. And because she bore Cortez a son, Doña Marina has been deemed the mother of the first Mexican mestizo. Their child could not have been the first, but her union with Cortez, literally and metaphorically, inextricably binds her to the history of the mestizaje. Many Mexican texts and images speak to these conflicted understandings. Two well-known works from the mid-20th century include Antonio Ruiz's painting El Sueño de la Malinche, The Dream of Malinche, and Octavio Paz's essay The Sons of Malinche, in which he castigates Doña Marina as the violated mother of the Mexican nation. More recently, in the late 1960s and 70s, Chicana writers, artists, and activists began rethinking the story of Malinche. In 16th century sources, they found neither victim nor traitor, but the strength of a survivor. Malinche did not choose her destiny, but neither did she crumble in the face of adversity. So, no discussion of the rise of the Mexican people is complete without talking about an important symbol of Mexican identity, which is that of La Virgen de Guadalupe. Very important icon. If you've ever seen a car that has a giant, vinyl sticker of the Virgin on the back. Virgin icons are very common throughout the entire world. And one thing for sure we know is that these apparitions, these appearances of Mary, she tends to look like the people that see her. So if you travel into parts of the Caribbean and places in the world where people's skin is very dark or they're black, you might see a black virgin. We look at the imagery coming out of Rome, out of Spain, right? In Europe, we see a very European-looking virgin. So what's important is that La Virgen de Guadalupe, she is brown skin. She is a mestizo. And so very important to the identity that she represents the people. But the story surrounds a guy named Juan Diego. Allegedly born in 1474, Diego was originally a subject of the Aztec Empire. Now, his original Nahuatl name was Cuauhtaltatuatzin, which means eagle that talks. A talking eagle could probably do a better job at saying his name in Nahuatl than I can, ironically. But his beloved uncle in the story, in the legend, some may say myth, in the story, his uncle has converted to Christianity after the conquest and took the name Juan Bernardino. The native Nahuatl, let's see if I can say it again, Cuauhtaltatuatzin, and his wife which that name is Juan Diego, converted in 1525, and he takes the name Juan Diego, and his wife takes the name Maria Lucia. Juan Diego was reportedly a humble, short of stature man who only spoke Nahuatl. He lived in the village of Cuautitlan, which was about 15 miles from Mexico City at the time. Juan Diego would regularly walk that distance to hear Mass at the Franciscan convent at Tlatelolco. In 1531, the year of his visions, Juan Diego was 57. Tepeyac Hill was once a place where a temple was, and worship of the Aztec goddess Tonatzin was carried out in this place. This is important because this is where he sees the Virgin. Now, scholars and historians of religion, anthropologists, look back at this and say, if it were to be an attempt by the Spanish to syncretize the religion of the people, the indigenous people, and the new Spanish Catholicism, this would be a way to do that, to sort of subvert the old Aztec goddess Tonantzin and give this new sort of kind of revamp her into the Mother Mary, the Queen of Heaven, right, the goddess. Now, most Protestants don't see Mary as anything other than the Mother of God. She's not elevated. But in Catholicism, there's the ascension of Mary. There's the, perfection of Mary, that she was taken up into heaven. In many ways, she's thought of as the Queen of Heaven. She's a goddess in a sense. So the concept here is thought to maybe have come along and replaced the entire Aztec goddess Tonantzin worship process and sort of give a story of the apparition taking place in this location in an attempt to subvert or win over or syncretize, bring together and work together the old religion and the new religion in order to, successfully steer the new, culture of Spanish colonialism. So the Spanish conquistadors and priests had actually destroyed the temple at Tepeyac Hill, but it continued to be a place of veneration to the subjugated Aztecs. So the first vision, on the morning of December 9th, 1531, Juan Diego sets off alone to Tlatelolco, where the Franciscan Mass would have been happening. He could go there. So he sets off alone to Tlatelolco. Unfortunately, Maria Lucia had died in 1529, so this is a couple years later. So as he passes Tepeyac Hill, he hears music, and he hears a voice calling his name. He followed the voice and the music to the top of the hill, where he beholds this shimmering vision of a beautiful lady. She said she was the Virgin Mary and asked him where he's going, responding that he was headed to Tlatelolco. Lolco, that's it, Lolco, sorry. It's just difficult to say. Responding, he says, I'm headed to Tlatelolco. She told him to tell the Archbishop Juan de Zumarraga that it was her desire that he build a great church dedicated to her on this place, Tepeyac Hill, where the Mother Goddess had once been overthrown. And so Juan Diego assures her that he'd pass on this message, and he hurries off to Mexico City. He manages to get to see Archbishop Zumarraga and tells his story through a translator. The Archbishop clearly does not believe Juan Diego and sends him away. And there's a second vision. On his way home, Juan Diego once again has to pass Tepeyac Hill. The Virgin Mary was waiting for him, and he told her what happened, admitting his failure to convince the Archbishop of the need to build the shrine to Mary on Tepeyac Hill. He asks Mary to find someone more important to carry out this process and to carry her message because no one's listening to him. In his mind, he's, I'm a native. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say. I'm just an Indian. What do you? She replies that she had chosen him and that he must do it. She told him to return to the Archbishop the following day and try again, and he promised to. Then he went home and went to bed. Okay, the third vision. Juan Diego returns to Mexico City the following day and with some difficulty manages to get a second audience with Archbishop Zumarraga. This time, the humble Indian's obvious emotion convinces the priest to at least hear him out, but he remains skeptical. He told Juan Diego to return with some sort of sign. When Juan Diego asked what sort of sign would please the Archbishop, he tells him that if it's a true vision, the Virgin Mary would come up with some convincing miracle. She always does. That's how she rolls, right? So Juan Diego returns to the hill to find the Virgin Mary waiting for him. He told her that the Archbishop wants her to send an indisputable sign. She told him, return the following day, and that she would have a sign for him then. She also assured him that he would be richly rewarded for doing this service for her. The fourth vision. So the next day, Juan Diego went to see his uncle, Juan Bernardino, who was very ill. His uncle told him to make haste to Tlatelolco and return with a priest to perform the last rites. Juan Diego rushes off, anxious to return before his uncle dies. When he reaches Tepeyac Hill, he doesn't really want to see the Virgin, ironically. He tries to sneak around it, unseen by the Virgin Mary, because he didn't want to interrupt his search for a priest. He was more concerned about getting the last rites for his uncle. It didn't work. The Virgin calls out to him and asks why he was trying to avoid her. I bet that was awkward. He told her the reason, and she responded that he should not worry. His uncle had been cured while they were speaking. So the Virgin then told him that she had prepared proof for Archbishop Zumarraga. She told Juan Diego to gather some flowers that were growing at the top of the hill. He climbed up, found that the hilltop was covered with brightly colored flowers of all varieties. He gathers up as many as he can and puts them in his tilma, which is an apron-like piece of cloth that he wears. She tells him not to open the tilma until he was in the presence of Archbishop Zumarraga, and he went on his way. In Mexico City, he was once again able to get to see the Archbishop, who was in a meeting with several other important ecclesiastical figures. Juan Diego opens his tilma, and flowers fall out. But the colors of the flowers had bled into his garment, creating a beautiful image of the Virgin Mary. Archbishop Zumarraga and the others, knowing they were in the presence of a true vision, fell to their knees and celebrated. The shrine of Guadalupe, Archbishop Zumarraga immediately ordered that a small shrine be built on the spot where a larger basilica could be planned. Juan Diego returned home with a representative of the Archbishop and was overjoyed to find his uncle in perfect health. When the Archbishop's representative asked Juan Bernardino about the healing, he responded that the Virgin of Guadalupe had done it. Juan Diego was put in charge of the shrine and the image on his tilma until his death some years later, May 30th, 1548. The shrine grew in size and importance, and the Virgin of Guadalupe was credited with the conversion to Christianity of countless former subjects of the Aztec Empire. It continues to be hugely important to all Mexicans to this day, and it is an important national symbol. The original image is on display at a massive cathedral on the original site of Tepeyac Hill, now swallowed up by the urban sprawl of Mexico City, and receives millions of visitors and pilgrims annually. So, the article had some interesting stuff to say. Hopefully you were able to read that article. But by no coincidence, Tepeyac had served as an ancient pilgrimage site dedicated to several pre-Columbian earth deities, who were referred to in the early colonial period by the generic name of Tonatzin, meaning our revered mother. So, in the ambitious program to evangelize all native peoples after the conquest, Catholic shrines were superimposed on pre-Hispanic temples. This is not a mystery. This is what we know historically. So given its traditional significance, Tepeyac would have been a logical place for a chapel or hermitage, probably dedicated to one of the many cults of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception imported by the Spaniards. While scantily documentation has obscured the origins of the Guadalupe devotion, it is likely that neither a shrine specifically dedicated to the Mexican Virgin of Guadalupe nor an image of her existed prior to 1555 or 1556. So iconographic and stylistic evidence suggests that the Tilmactil icon was painted by a native artisan, perhaps as early as the middle of the century. So by this period, one of the most common representations of the Immaculate Conception relied on the biblical text of the apocalyptic woman described in St. John. The creator of the Guadalupe icon appears to have used a model as a late 15th or 16th century engraving from the book of Revelation. Like the apocalyptic woman, Revelation 12:1, Guadalupe is clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. She stands on a crescent moon, the sun's rays creating an almond-shaped mandorla, or glory, around her, with the 12 stars that crown her head in the Bible multiplied and scattered over the surface of her blue mantle. The Virgin at Tepeyac was called Guadalupe after a popular shrine in the region of Extremadura in central Spain. In spite of the church's zealous program of evangelization, by the time of the First Mexican Church Council in 1555, the failure to eradicate paganism had become patently clear. So the hierarchy of, acknowledged that this Indian resistance and domination, both overtly in the form of uprisings and covertly in the persistence of their traditional religious beliefs, they saw there was a problem. So they took some aggressive methods to indoctrinate. They tried to substitute new Christian saints for old gods and the incorporation of parallel beliefs and ritual. The Mexican Virgin of Guadalupe was one of such fusion of imported European mother of God imagery with native mother goddess, the pre-Columbian earth deities, the Virgin Mary of popular Spanish Catholicism, had power over fertility, disease, and disasters. However, while these similarities facilitated syncretic solutions, they also undermined Christian orthodoxy. In 1576, the Franciscan friar Sahagan complained that the pilgrimages to Tepeyac were only a continuation of the pre-Hispanic practices, and that the native worshippers consistently refer to Guadalupe as Tonatzin, a name that is still linked to Guadalupe in some regions of Mexico. Aside from her association with a traditionally sacred space, her female gender, and her reputed powers over natural forces, the Mexican Guadalupe was an eminently European image that had little meaning for the native worshiper. The classical beauty of Spanish Marian images and the standardized immaculate iconography were modified in the painted icon to include ashen, olive skin, and straight black hair, just like the very people that they were trying to encourage to worship Mary. Along with her humble attitude and pious gesture, the Virgin of Guadalupe conveniently reflected the colonial church's image of the native population that it sought to bring under its control. So there we have some of the history of the Aztecs. We've got Hernan Cortez and his conquistadors who conquered. We've got the rise of the Mexica, forming a city that becomes New Spain, but later Mexico City. We've got the story of how Cortez had a translator, Malinche, and we've got the interesting parallels between Tonantzin and the Virgin of Guadalupe and kind of the backstory on that. So there you go. That's some of the information I was going to include for this chapter.